right, so we are live. We want to welcome everyone to our our summer history virtual tours. And today we're going to be exploring the Hough neighborhood. And I just want to thank everyone, and I want to thank Pat for again joining us for this walk. So we are going to be exploring Hough, which will be a lot of fun. And Pat, you probably have a lot of familiarity with the Hough neighborhood on the city council. So, tell us a little bit before we get started about some of that, because we have lots of entities in the Hough. We're actually going to show a video from the Hough Foundation in a minute, but talk a little bit about Hough as a neighborhood.
Oh, well, it's it is the only historic neighborhood in the state. It was originally called, when it began to be developed, it was called Prospect Park. And the referred to it as a bright prospect for the future. It's a fascinating neighborhood of old and new. Do we want to talk about? It was one of our earliest neighborhood organizations.
Yeah,
when we were forming neighborhoods in the 90s. Hough had already been a neighborhood for quite some time and centered around the school, Hough School, which we'll visit and talk about later on.
Yeah, and in just a second, we're actually going to have, luckily we were able to reach out to Jill Campbell with the Hough Foundation, and we're able to get a little clip that, if I'm looking right here, we should get about 10 seconds until we're going to play that. And they're really, the Hough neighborhood has just had so many great organizations, and actually Hough Foundation is thanks to Paul Christensen, who went to the school. And
grit is that passion, that desire, that fire in your belly that causes you to wake up every morning and decide that this is what I want to do. Gardening teaches us patience. It teaches us to stick to our projects, and hopefully we can teach them to do that throughout their entire life.
Music's really the full embodiment of grit. Learning an instrument is not easy. It takes a lot of try and do again and failing. And being a musician, you have to have that passion and perseverance.
Something that I think is largely missing from a lot of students today is that stick-to-itiveness, that ability to see something through.
We ask them to make a commitment for the entire year.
And once they succeed, it's amazing because they have so much fun with it and they never want to stop exposing that skill.
We're building those skills where kids can go out into the world and stick with something else.
These are the kids going through our program who are going to end up getting the jobs and getting the college scholarships.
We had a student who exclaimed in class, "This is awful," and threw her paper off to the side. Grit is about the ability to see the power of possibilities. So we sat down and had a discussion about possibilities. After a while, she had some wonderful creative inspiration. She had worked through the challenge, and it was a very meaningful project for her and for us to watch that process.
So yeah, there's a little bit from the Hough Foundation, which is really great. And again, yeah, the Hough neighborhood is it's one of the older neighborhoods, right?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
And
a lot of very influential people resided in Hough, and that's, I guess, what we're going to go walk and look at, right? Right.
Exactly. So this one here is not in the Hough neighborhood. This is technically in the Arnada neighborhood, but this is the museum. And actually off to the left, we can see the descendant of the old apple tree. Obviously, we've had quite a week when it comes to that. If you want to talk a little bit about the apple tree.
Yes, that is a graft from the old apple tree. They were English greening apples. I know that horses love them. They kind of taste quincy, kind of a sour apple used for baking. And of course, some people remember the gigantic ancient elm that once stood in front of the museum. That's also one of our losses of terrific trees.
I know we've had a lot of rich history of trees. So this building here is always interesting. When you look out from the museum, you see it, the one to the right here to the center, and that was Quarter Motors, and that was built in 1945, and it housed the Quarter Motors Company. And in 1950, they self-proclaimed that they were one of the most modern shops in the Northwest, and it was ran by Lauren H. Quarter, who was president, and his wife Josephine actually served as secretary and treasurer. And it was a car, and there was a lot of dealerships right up and down this area of Main Street. And in the later days, in the 40s and the 50s, and kids would cruise up and down here, so it was kind of a lot of car culture, right?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. 1945, we hadn't had cars for the whole World War II era, and you ordered your car kind of sight unseen, hoping to get one by 1946. Bill Marshall told me that when he came back from the war, he didn't think anyone would ever pay $1,000 for a car.
So this block is really interesting. We in Vancouver, we tend to have places that have new buildings, but they have history that happened on the dirt, right? And this one here on the northern side of the block, right, was where the Holland Creamery and the Holland Restaurant were at. That's correct, right?
That's right. Jacob Propstra started his creamery actually in Ridgefield and then moved down to Vancouver. George Propstra said he was called the baby in the oven because when they moved from, this is George's story, when they moved from Ridgefield, they had their stove in the back of the truck and they put George in the oven to keep him safe as they drove south. So he was the baby in the oven.
I've never heard that story. That's really great.
Yeah,
And,
that's George. But Jacob started his creamery there, ice cream, butter, and then began to make sandwiches. And then George came along and it became a full-fledged restaurant that was where everything happened in Vancouver, happened in the dining room of the Holland.
And see, that's why I think it's so important, even though it's not there anymore, that we continue to mention that space is where that happened. And another one, Schofield's Corner. So tell us a little bit about this space. This is a really interesting one.
Oh, Mary Schofield was the first woman bank president. The Schofield family is still active. The office for the Schofield business is in that corner. Safeway was there. It was really, that was going to the outskirts now.
And the reason that was the outskirts is because Uptown Village really grew during this celebration of the 100th anniversary of the Hudson's Bay Company, and they had this big centennial celebration. And this church we see right here, this is one of those things. It was built between 1923 and 1925, and it was the first Christian church. And this is a real, you had houses up here before you had any of these buildings, and they took these houses out to build this whole kind of brand new business district. And do you know a little bit about the church here?
Well, the church, it's one of our historic register churches. Very unique architecture. At the time it was built, it was something that people drove around to see. Oh, the mural.
Yep, talk about that.
A photograph. You have that photograph.
Mm-hmm. And the church was really interesting because they continued to expand all the way into the 50s, and we actually ended up finding out that they broke ground on an annex for that church that was across the street. And one of the interesting stories that we found was that on October 13th, 1939, the first daily broadcast of the Christian Call aired on KVAN radio from 8:45 to 9 a.m. And it was sponsored. Sponsors were the Crusaders of Washington and Oregon, and many ministers participated. And it was the Congregants Reverend Walter Givens that instituted the radio program. And before his death, he had given 1,361 daily broadcasts. And when Givens passed away on Palm Sunday, April 2nd, 1944, the broadcast ended. Brother Givens, who had failing health at the time, he ended up passing away after that broadcast. So it's just an interesting history related to that, to this church. And now it's continued to be different congregations over the years. And actually, as we walk back here, you can see that annex, and that's where the First Christian congregation actually occupies today.
And note that intricate brickwork.
Yeah, it just
incredible, absolutely incredible. Main Street, of course, especially Uptown, developed along what they call the line of the street railway.
Mm-hmm.
very typical. I'm sure we're going to do Uptown at another time. Very typical of the development along transportation.
And one of the benefactors of that was a Mr. Arthur J. Collings, who actually, if you look at the greenhouse that's off to the right, that was his home. And we just passed, when we walked across Main Street, his grocery store. And he was the owner of the Pioneer grocery store that constructed that building at 20th and Main. And the Collings family was actually pretty prominent. His father, Abram Collings, was a prominent Vancouver citizen, and he was a Civil War veteran and participated in the Battle of Brownsville, and he moved to Vancouver, or to the Pacific Northwest, in 1873, and then Vancouver in 1903, and he was a bailiff for the Superior Court. And one claim to fame that Abrams had was that he was able to vote for Abraham Lincoln twice, which was a fun thing. And then Arthur actually lived in this greenhouse here, and he was really heavily involved in the grocery business in Clark County. In 1914, he was actually appointed to frame an ordinance desired by 100 merchants who sent a petition to the city council to prevent legislation for dishonest advertising or fake sales conducted by outside vendors from Vancouver. So just very, very interesting story in relations to Arthur Collings. And these are those things that, we were talking about, always learning new things all the time. And this is one of those stories a few people know about Collings, but you see his name on that building on Main Street, and then we were able to connect it with his house.
Yes, and these are magnificent houses.
Well, this whole neighborhood is designated as a historic district, only one in
Yes.
Clark County that's designated by the state in that way. Obviously, we have Officers Row with its designation, but this is a state recognized neighborhood. And this house is kind of funny. It's the Tappendorf house. We actually know this was owned by Paul F. Tappendorf, owner of Vancouver Lumber, in 1909. And we don't know much about his business, but we know he got into some trouble once in a while. In 1908, he removed a bridge on Stockford Road in the county, and that ended up in a legal dispute. And then later, he left this home. He moved to Portland and ran a hotel, and he ran into legal trouble while he was there in Portland because he was involved in a court case where he had dumped water on a local umbrella vendor who reported the incident and remarked as the vendor was small and pugnacious. So just interesting stories. Now, this is a huge house because this is the Peter J. Flynn house. Do you know a little bit about Peter?
Well, he had the Flynn furniture store downtown, which was the place for the elite to get their furniture. And I believe it's still there. On the back of the building, you can still see the name Flynn painted on the building from the next street over.
Yeah, and Peter was
still there. You never know when things are going to go away.
That's true, and he was a big deal because whenever we type like in the photo collection photos for Kiggins, they'll give us that photo that's down the road, and you'll see that big Flynn sign on there. Yeah, it was a big deal. And Peter, this was his home that he built around 1926, and this is a two-door style home, which you see a few of these. And Peter's father, James Flynn, actually was born in Ireland in 1857, and he came to the United States and he married his wife around 1884, and they had 4 children. And in 1903, James actually started Flynn Furniture in Monmouth, Oregon, and eventually he moved the store to Vancouver, and Peter took over and became a really, really significant person in the history of Vancouver and Clark County.
Oh, absolutely.
So this house over here is interesting because we were able to find out that we call this the Knapp Chumacero home because Rush H. Knapp, who was a member of the Knapp family and a local grocer, actually lived here until his passing in 1925 with his wife Lola, who ended up leaving as a widow. And we believe that a member of the Chumacero family also moved in here with her. And Rush actually started in the undertaking business with his brother. But what happened is there's an article here that we found that says Lola and Rush's story was interesting because on April 4th, 1910, the local newspaper read this, that Rush G. Knapp last evening stole a march on his brother, W. J. Knapp, county coroner, and married Miss Lola H. Hill. Essentially, it seems he took his brother's love interest. And at that point, we looked in the records and we don't know for sure, but Rush is no longer in the undertaking business. He becomes in the grocery business. So I think there was a schism there.
There could well have been. Well, the Knapp's funeral home records, I believe, are in the museum now, and a great source of information from the Knapp funeral records.
Yep. And the last house we were looking at, we actually just recently started looking into that one. And that one is actually connected to Arthur Fletcher, who obviously the Fletcher Daniels connection. And
Yes.
Arthur was born in Vancouver in 1870. And so we're still looking into some of those. Now,
Fletcher Daniels shows up on so many property records, just very influential in the community. This look, they can imagine visiting back and forth with all of these really powerful, influential people living in such a close proximity.
yep. And we see again another house here, and it's a lot of these homes you have these, or these neighborhoods, you have these little homes that are kind of tucked out of the way with this brickwork. And this has some of that similar brickwork, but it's way more scaled down, like we saw on the church when we walked in. And this was interesting because you had the Knapps and Fletcher and all these people, but then you had these smaller working class homes. So people were living next to each other. And this house is really interesting. It was built in 1908, and it's known as the George Ungemacht House, who was a local auto dealer and politician in Ridgefield. And he was a Clark County commissioner from 1922 to 1928. And so he was actually in office when they ended up lifting the tolls on the interstate bridge. So talk a little bit about the interstate bridge, since we have an opening here to talk about that with tolls and the bridge development.
Building the interstate bridge. We tried so hard to build that bridge. We had our legislators did pass legislation to pay for the bridge. The governor vetoed it. When the governor vetoed the money for the bridge, then Oregon dropped out as well. The Prunarians were to come along later, but their group from the Columbia Club, which was like Chamber of Commerce. The Columbia Club was a business club. And they got a band together with banners and a bagpiper and went to the Portland Chamber of Commerce, and with the banner said, "We need the bridge, and so do you. We've done our part. Now you come through." And they put $600 in gold on the table as symbol of their commitment. It wound up that Portland passed $1.5 million tax levy. We borrowed 500,000. Our county, the county commissioners, borrowed 500,000, and the two counties built the bridge rather than the state. I think that's remarkable. There was a group in Battleground that sued to keep the bridge from being built because they said only people in Vancouver would use it.
Oh, wow. So yeah, we're going to give you a lot of time on this one as we come up. You see this house on the horizon. This is the Beauregard house. So this is the home of was the home of J.J. Beauregard. So tell us what you know.
Talk about that one. You've got that information. It's exciting.
Yep. So this house was built around 1910, and it was built by J.J. Beauregard and his wife Elizabeth, and their daughter Ethel actually lived in this house. And Beauregard actually came to Vancouver in 1894 as a soldier, and not long after he ended up establishing himself when he got a good deal of wealth, and he was the owner of a pawn shop at 702 Main Street. And as you have written about and talked about, there was an incident in that pawn shop one evening between him and his wife.
Yes. He had the jewelry store down on Main Street. The streetcar ran right in front. He was going on a hunting trip, and she got a gun, got on the streetcar, went down to the jewelry store, said, "I know what kind of deer you're going to be hunting for," and shot him. He fell to the floor. The police came, literally a smoking gun. He said, "Don't blame her, don't blame her." She was tried for murder and was found not guilty by reason of insanity, and was let go and lived out her life in that house. It's a magnificent house.
And that you had people actually come down to the museum and talk with you and want to know about that house, and then they ended up telling you they believed it was haunted, right?
Yes, there was one young man. It had become a rental after her death, and he had cold spots. He heard people on the stairway. He was just little fires, and he was so concerned. Uh, when I told him the story, he said, "Well, is it her or Mr. Beauregard who's haunting?" Well,
Mm.
I don't know. Has to be one of the two.
So have I ever told you the story of how a watermelon saved his life?
No.
So JJ Beauregard, obviously a man of means, he was able to drive down to California on a trip years before he got shot. And as he was driving, he was going through the desert, and all of a sudden his car radiator began to boil over, and then eventually it boiled dry, and he's in the middle of this road in this desert. And what happens is he's sitting there, basically he's going to die at this point, and he realizes he has a watermelon in the back of his car. He takes it, crushes it up, puts it in a bucket. And again, I don't know anything about cars. This is what the news reported. He crushes the watermelon up, puts it in the bucket, pours the liquid into the radiator, gets it up, gets it back and running, goes to Bakersfield, gets his car fixed back up. And then a couple of years later, his wife shoots and kills him. So
Yeah.
The article for this account was called Melon Saves Motorist.
Oh.
Just never forget that one. So this home here is really interesting. This is the home of Charles Thayer, built around 1924. And actually a man by the name of William Curran lived in this house for a time. And Curran was actually a local politician. He was on the city council, and he was also on the library board during the time when the Grand Army of the Republic was asked to leave the library.
Oh,
and
that Mr. Perky did that.
Yep. So he was one of those. And then later, Charles Thayer, who was a superintendent of operations at Alcoa, moved his family in here. And he was actually had the opportunity to meet FDR during that time when FDR actually visited, Franklin Delano Roosevelt actually visited Alcoa. And Alcoa was a big deal in Vancouver, right? And talk about that a little bit.
Vancouver, Alcoa was huge. They came here because the dam, because the Bonneville Dam opening gave us cheap electricity, and that brought Alcoa here. Of course, during the war, they were vital to the war effort, which is why FDR, they actually drove Roosevelt's car into the factory since he couldn't walk in, and they didn't want to take him in a wheelchair. They had the car with the top down, actually drove it into the plant. Alcoa was a huge employer in Clark County.
And then this house here has another tie to a pretty significant family. So this is the home of, this was built around 1920. It was the home of Joseph Durgan, who was a lifelong Vancouver resident, born in 1881. Durgan was the son of Simeon and Anna Durgan. And they actually came out west on covered wagon. And his father operated a dairy in the early days of Vancouver at the site that would eventually become the shipyards. And Durgan himself married Victoria Ryan, which the Ryan family, right, has a huge significance in this neighborhood.
Oh my goodness, yes. Ryan's all over. There was a George Washington Durgan early on,
mm-hmm.
who founded the volunteer fire department. George Washington had a furniture store and it burned. And so he founded the volunteer fire department to keep future businesses from burning.
And the Durgan family was really industrious. I mean, like you're saying, there was George Washington, there was other folks, because Durgan himself included, his activities was part ownership of the Ryan Allen Lumber Company, which was a really big deal. He owned the Columbia Feed and Fuel Company and the Independent Lumber Company. And for 15 years, he was the director and appraiser for the Vancouver Federal Savings and Loan Association. And during World War II was the federal land appraiser for military installations in the Vancouver area. And he was also involved in the Oddfellows and the Elks. So, I mean, he didn't let any grass grow under his feet at all.
Have you noticed that these early prominent men were involved in everything, absolutely everything? They ran for office, they ran businesses, they were in nonprofits, they were in fellowships, brotherhoods. astounding how very involved they were compared to today, where if we have 2 or 3 things, we consider ourselves overwhelmed.
Yeah, I think they probably had less Netflix and Hulu to watch back then. So,
Well, yes, that's
so the next house we're coming up on is this one. I love this one. It's always fun to look at. This is the Shaw House, and it was built around 1920. And this home was occupied and completed by John William Shaw. And Shaw was a postmaster of Vancouver and held the position for nearly 9 years. He also served 2 terms in the Washington State Senate. And before moving to this location and holding those 2 positions, Shaw was actually appointed a police judge for the city of Vancouver. And in this capacity, he would preside over a court of record that has jurisdiction over, minor offenses and the power to bind for trial in the Superior Court. And from some records that I was able to find, we found this one thing, and it's a report that comes out. It says J.W. Shaw, police judge, started an innovation of trusting a prisoner who he had fined. He trusted to the honor of the man to send him a money order for the amount of the fine, $5. So B.D. Holloway was arrested by police for being drunk, and when he appeared before the judge in court, he said that he was a woodcutter of woodland and that he had come to Vancouver and fallen by the wayside, and spending all of his earnings in, quote, riotous living. He looked honest, so Judge Shaw thought, so he said this: "You're hardworking, and I don't want to humiliate you by putting you in jail for your first offense. I will give you another trial. I'm going to fine you $5 in cost and trust to your honor that you will send me the money after your first paycheck." So just interesting little stories that we're able to find when we're looking at these. And then this house is the A.P. Ryan house.
Asa Ryan, and that's Ryan Lumber. When he was a lad, he and another boy, Laws, built a model airplane out of bits of wood and paper and flew it, and it reached 20 feet in altitude. Their uncle founded Ryan Aviation and was building airplanes. So he had that inspiration from his uncle, but he did not follow him into building airplanes, of course. Instead, the Ryan Lumber Company.
Yeah, and Dr. Ryan that lived at this place, he was a dentist for a period of time and actually had his office out of there also. And one of the things that we found was that the house that we saw right there, the design is said to have been chosen from Lady Home Journal, which happened back in the day. People would end up purchasing stuff from Lady Home Journal.
But yeah, the Sears houses, the Ladies' Home Journal houses.
You used to be able to get all kinds of stuff just out of catalogs and whatnot.
Yes. I remember as a child always looking forward to the Sears catalog. You pick out your Christmas presents.
And there was also another Ryan, and we're actually not going to be able to pass her house, but Viola Ryan Allen, her house is also in that neighborhood. And she was another prominent member of the family. And she ended up working in the public schools, and Viola remained the first principal. She was the first woman principal at Vancouver School District and served that for a number of years. And then this house is the Charles Zimmerman house. And this is one of the other houses that's on the register. And talk a little bit about, Charles was in military, but his house ended up on the register. Talk a little bit about what it means for these houses and all this stuff to be on the register.
Oh, well, first of all, Charles Zimmerman was another one who came here with the Army. He had been a commissary sergeant. So he learned the whole retail trade as commissary sergeant in the Army. When you put the house on the register, you get a plaque, of course. The house has to look, it should be 50 years old, but that can be waived if something very historic happened there. It should be recognizable to the original owner. So it can be changed, but not so drastically that it would not be recognizable. can't do big changes to the windows, for instance. And sometimes states will pass tax breaks for recognized historic sites.
Yeah.
Hough School. You want to talk about Hough School?
Actually, we'll be walking back to it. We're heading over to right now. We're heading to the Elliot Ryan house, the house where Thomas Elliot lived. Which this, from what we know, Reverend Thomas Elliot and Miss Elliot were married in England, and we'll see the house in just a minute. And after their marriage, they came to the U.S. First, they lived in Cleveland, then Ohio, and then Seattle, and then they were in Hadlock, Washington, where Dr. Elliot became a circuit Methodist minister. And they had 3 children and 2 daughters and a son. And Amy their daughter ended up marrying A.P. Ryan, which we had just talked about. And Thomas Elliot became he came to the First Vancouver Methodist Church as a senior minister in 1904, and he served in the church until 1907, when he was one of the more prominent Vancouver ministers and a natural leader in the area. And you see the house right here is the house that we're talking about. And he left Vancouver to become superintendent of the Tacoma district. And he was a practicing elder in the Methodist Conference for many, many years. And this house also has a connection to Day Hilborn. A portion of it was designed by Day Hilborn. So talk a little bit about Day Hilborn and his significance.
Well, Day Hilborn, Vancouver is the town Day Hilborn built. He was such a prominent architect. He designed the courthouse, the Spick and Span restaurant, churches all over, actually the Southwest Washington, but predominantly here in Vancouver. The Day Hilborn touch is everywhere.
Yeah, Kiggin's Theater, the courthouse, the Medical Arts Building, and then we have our other
arts building, yes.
And we have our other architect here, Donald Stewart, who was also really prominent. He designed Hough School, and it was kind of Hilborn and Stewart that were designing all across Southwest Washington over a number of years. So if you live in a Stewart or a Hilborn house, you live in a piece of history. And then Hough School itself was built in 1941, and Stewart was the one who designed it, but its namesake. So we haven't even talked about the name.
No, we haven't.
So tell us why this neighborhood and this school is called Hough.
Paddy Hough was born in Limerick in Ireland, 1846, the beginning of the Great Hunger, the potato famine, which drove so many young people out of Ireland. He was a staunch Republican, not a Republican as we know Republicans, but as Republic of Ireland, independent from Britain. He joined the French army during the Franco-Prussian War because France was a republic fighting against an empire. He lost his arm. He was a ambulance driver and lost his arm. Went back to Ireland. There was no future for a 20-something one-armed man in Ireland at that time. So he went to British Columbia, went to work for a Catholic boys' school. There, that school took in boys of every race, every religion, and that stuck with Paddy. He went from there to Holy Angels College, which was by St. James Church. And from St. James College to the Vancouver schools, became principal, became superintendent. He was beloved, just a beloved teacher. That's all you hear about during his life is our dear beloved Paddy. When he died in the 1920s, his friends had been so worried about him because he lived so penuriously. His shoes were run over, his clothes were threadbare. Not like he had always been so dapper. When his will was read, they found out why. He appointed 3 of his friends to be stewards, and he said that he had been saving every penny to build a school for boys and girls somewhere in the center of Clark County to teach agriculture and mechanical skills, and that staff and children should be chosen on merit only without regard to race or creed, which was way ahead of everything in the 20s. The Casey School out near Battleground is financed in part by that small inheritance that Patty left, which had grown. Various shepherds of the fund had taken good care of it over the years, and it had grown to well over $1 million by the time that school was finally. He also wanted it named Selvois. Selvois was the little town in Limerick where he was born. Born into a life of really tough going, and he turned into a man that gave and cared for others. An inspiring man.
Yeah, and it's just an incredible story, you know, that's a big reason why the school in the neighborhood is named after him, is because of that inspirational educational story that he provided.
Yes. Yes, indeed.
All right. Well,
neighborhood.
So is there anything that we forgot to talk about regarding the Hough neighborhood and Patty Hough that you could think of?
The dentist, his daughter, C.C. Smith, is still in the house. His wife, in order to pay for it, she wanted the house paid for completely when he came home from the war. And so she rented rooms to young women who had come to Vancouver to say farewell to their boyfriends, their lovers. They couldn't, of course, stay in a hotel. That was shocking. But she rented the rooms and had weddings in the living room for these boys and girls. I can't remember how many weddings she had in that living room. But a substantial number. She paid off the house. And he was one of the founders of OMSI. It was scientists, doctors in the Army that founded OMSI to begin with.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
It's a great story.
Well, thank you so much for joining us again on the Walk of Hough today. That was a lot of fun, and it's a lot of, you know, obviously as designated by you know, a historic neighborhood by Washington State. It's just got so much history and a lot of beautiful homes. So thanks again, Pat, for joining us, and thank you everyone again for joining us for our digital walk. And we'll see you again next week for another fun walking tour. Take care.
Where are we going next week?
Next week, we are in Lower and Upper Main, I believe. So we'll be looking at all those really popular business buildings down there on Main Street. So it's going to be some pretty big hitters.
Exciting.
All right. Thanks again, Pat, and we'll see you all next week.